How's it going, Shauli? It's great to get you on the podcast. I think that we've been planning this for quite a while, but I'm really excited for our conversation today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I start everyone off with telling their background, how you got into IT, what made you want to get into, cybersecurity overall. And the reason why I do that is because there's people that are listening or watching on YouTube, of course, at this point, um, that might be trying to make that transition for themselves. And I feel like hearing someone's story and maybe it lines up, they can say, "Oh, well, if he did it, I might be able to do this thing too." I look back on my life earlier on, right, and all I ever needed was to see someone else do it. It's like, oh, well, if he could do it, maybe I can do this too. So where does that story start for you?
Well, I think I've been in and out of IT or engineering or technology, in different roles. But to be honest, like going to engineering for me was kind of like the natural thing to do. The fact that I'm today more of like a business and management type person, running a company is actually, for me, the surprising part. Like I would be if I needed to guess when I was 16 where I'll be, at 45, I would probably say I'm going to be like an architect, like a technology architect, software architect, or engineer or something like that. I was super good, like, in math and physics when I was younger. So like the natural kind of like, I would say path for people, like me, especially in Israel, where, software and engineering is so popular, was, hey, you finish your army service, you go to learn engineering, software engineering, that's just what you do, you know, uh, pretty much. So I went into that and, then I started working for, my first company. After school, I was an algorithms engineer. I really like solving problems. For me, being a software engineer and algorithms engineer was just almost like continuing the studies and solving more, riddles. It was like, a new algorithm is like a riddle for me, and how you can make it most effective. I wrote a few patents under my name. Back in the days, I wasn't in security. I was more in algorithms for video compression and multimedia. And then, I worked as an engineer for a few years, and then I moved to a security startup and kind of like got a hang of security and did some security software development. And then actually, my path went sideways a little bit when I actually went to do my MBA in the University of Pennsylvania in the States. And that took me to like another path of, I went into management consulting and advisory and stuff like that. And actually what brought me back into technology was, being back in the startup scene, opening a startup, first joining a startup and then opening a startup together with my co-founders.
What made you want to go down the MBA route?
It was a bit opportunistic, to be honest. I was like, back in the days, I was a team leader in a software company in Israel. And a very good friend of mine, we are still good friends until today. Unlike me, he was like, we were together in like doing like our engineering degree together. And he knew was going to go down the business route. So he was planning to go to do an MBA, right after school. And he was planning his entire, he's much more planned than I, like his life, much more planned than I am. He knew he was going to go to do an MBA in one of the Ivy Leagues. And I didn't even know what Ivy League means back in the days. And then the reason I went there is that he was there. He was accepted to a school called Wharton, which then I joined him. And he called me one day, we were in touch and said, hey, Shauli, you got to apply. You got to apply. I know you, you love studying, you love diversity. You would love, what's going on here. You would love the level of education that these guys bring to the table. I really, really encourage you to do that. And that's how I kind of like started. I said, okay, I will apply. I wasn't really serious about it, to be honest. I said, I'll apply and see what happens. And then when you start to apply to these programs, you fall in love with them as you apply to them. You kind of like start to investigate them more and understand what's going on and see how global and what type of education they're going to give you. So that's how I kind of like fell in love with it, and then became more and more invested, and finally went ahead and studied there.
Hmm. Yeah, I've contemplated myself about getting an MBA, but I I'm not sure what I would do with it, and for me, like to put in that kind of time and effort, into it, right? I want to see results. I want to see ROI on it. And I'm not sure what I would do with that to, create that ROI. But, I totally relate when you say, someone else kind of told you to get into it and, it would, expand you in different ways and whatnot. Because I kind of went down that path with the PhD where, I've been exploring it for years, really thinking about it every year. It seemed I would like reassess the ROI that I would get from it and things like that. If there was topics that I wanted to look into or anything like that. And finally, this past year, I finally pulled the trigger and got into it. Right. So, and I mean, it's amazing that I guess I finally decided to get into it. Right. But now it's like, okay, I got to do the work,
Yeah, exactly.
and that's the part that's like really hard, I think, to estimate ahead of time because you don't know what you don't know. And getting a PhD is completely different. You're not in a classroom every single day. You're not having someone telling you, hey, you need to turn in this paper, you need to turn in this assignment or whatever it is. It's literally like, no, there's a body of work that you need to turn in. However long it takes you is how long it takes you. And it's like
Yeah.
there's no path, also like you're figuring out how to do it along the way.
Exactly. To be honest, I contemplated about a PhD myself so many times even before I did the MBA and after I did the MBA, just because I love studying so much. But the PhD is like, you need like extreme self-motivation, in order to make it happen and to do it well. Because life happens to you as you do it. Before we started
Mhm.
recording, we talked a little bit about kids and family, and then you have your work. So finding the time and the balance to actually do it, I really respect, the fact that you're up to it. And yeah, it really, really, really requires strong self-motivation.
Yeah, I approached it from two different angles, right? So I'm someone that comes from very little, right? Like my family wasn't well off or anything like that. I was the first in my family to go to college, all that sort of thing, right? So when I look at my daughter and I say to myself, well, I want to set a good example for her of what's possible, of, setting that bar as high as possible. I would say set it as high as possible. And if they aim for the bar, right, they'll land, even if they don't, meet it, right, they'll land somewhere that is a good place,
Yeah.
and just showing, her and my future kids, what that looks like, what's possible, right? Um, and same thing for my wife. Like my wife is finishing up her second master's degree.
Wow.
So it's definitely like a part, of us and who we are and everything. But then I also took it, another step, right? Because I'm always looking for trends in cybersecurity, what's coming 5 or 10 years down the road that maybe I should prepare for right now. And I did that with cloud security. Obviously I didn't see the very beginning of cloud security because I was getting my bachelor's at the time and wasn't paying attention to it or anything like that. But it was nowhere near as big as what it is today, but I figured that there was a lot of potential to go that route because VMware was so big at the time and this basically replaced it. And so I started going down the cloud security path, and here I am now in a larger security area. And so when I was looking at my PhD, I took that same approach and started to dive into satellite security. How
Right.
to actually secure satellites in space, how to, protect them against incoming attacks, how do you relay, communications to them, how would they be able to interact with communication systems, all that sort of thing. And so now, I'm really pushing myself to, I mean, I have a hard time saying be an expert, but I guess the PhD kind of gives you that without anything else, but to really dive into this thing and learn it, because there's so much that I don't know.
Yeah, just investing the time, to learn a topic, and eventually you just know more about it than other people because you just spent more time with it, right? It's just the mathematics of time.
Hmm. Are there, looking back now that you're, in charge of this company, right? Were there any key skills, maybe two or three key skills that you got from the MBA that really influence how you operate today?
Wow. I think so. I was a very, very analytical person. I was an engineer, math. Everything for me was like, I don't want to exaggerate by saying everything for me was black and white, but you know what I mean. I was a numbers type person, and the soft skills that you learn in an MBA and the variety of people that you meet, I think are the key, benefit that I got from it. Also, specifically for myself, it's not just about the MBA, it's about also, moving to another country with your family. So just the mere experience of moving to the United States, experiencing the culture, experiencing the values, and the work ethics, and how processes are done in a different country. Gives you a lot of perspective and a lot of new skills that you acquire. Um, and then quite frankly, my first job, after the MBA was in the Boston Consulting Group, which for me was really an extension of the MBA. You continue learning, and that company is, I don't want to promote them or anything, but they are so good at building your capabilities. Giving you frameworks to analyze situations, and structure your presentations, and communicate your thoughts and understand complex situations, which I think gave me a lot of value into what I'm doing today.
Hmm. Yeah, it must be very beneficial to come from, that engineering background, that engineering mindset, and go into a business because you can break apart problems and issues in different ways than what you would be able to without it, at least in my opinion. Um, because I'm just thinking, my day job, right? I'm principal cloud security engineer, right? So I'm breaking apart problems all day long.
Mhm.
Um, and finding, inconsistencies and, directing people towards a new or a better solution, right? Um, that 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 sounds a lot like what running a company is. You're encountered with problems constantly, and you have to filter out the ones that you want to pay attention to, the ones that will, make or break your company, right? Those are the ones that get your time. But then you also have like this back burner in your brain of like, oh yeah, I also need to adjust these other 10 or 15 things. Um, Being able to do that and manage that is, I mean, obviously it's extremely important for a company, but it's always interesting to hear how people get that experience because everyone gets it differently, I feel.
Yeah, I think problem solving is probably one of the key skills that any manager and leader needs to have. And as long as you're not, you know, as long as you have some soft skills to go along with it, because there are some great problem solvers that have zero, soft skills or emotional intelligence, and that's a big problem. But once you have that combination, I think that's where, you get to be very successful. And, even in my life, as I said, for example, when I was in a consulting company, right, you see that the engineers that come into that company, they become the best consultants because they have that mindset, and the recruiting process basically filters out the fact that they will have, some emotional intelligence and capabilities. So it makes them really, really good consultants. I have to say that another type of persona, there aren't many of those, um, because they usually stay they become doctors. But we had some people who came from medicine school, and that's also, a very good indicator. And if you think about it, like doctors are really engineers of the body, right? Like they need to evaluate situations and see signals and come up with solutions. So they also were very good in problem solving in general.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really fascinating. When people ask me how how to get promoted, you're already an engineer. You're already, really smart, intelligent area. How do you get promoted, to management or architecture? Right? I always start with the soft skills, because the soft skills is really what separates you from everyone else, right? Because everyone is used to that engineer, that tech guy that's, a little socially awkward, isn't really used to talking to other people. Everyone is used to that, right? So if you break that mold, you're immediately going to stand out. Even if you're breaking the mold in a controversial way, or maybe a poor way, right, in the beginning, you're still going to stand out. And hopefully you're standing out to the right people in the right frame of view or frame of mind, right? Um, but soft skills are extremely important, especially today where, so many of us are remote. The soft skills really pay dividends when, you're on a video call and you have to get across a point and make sure that people are understanding and break it down into a way that suits your audience. That's probably actually the biggest thing that I see a lot of people, mess up on, is not adjusting what you're saying to the audience that is in the call. Uh, you have to be able to, maybe go just an inch below the surface, right? Like, hey, here's all this stuff. None of it makes sense to you. That's okay, because this is what it's really doing. Give them that good overview so that they could take that slide and put their own words on it and present it to their management, right? Like, you have to think about it like that, and making that switch over in your mind is typically a really difficult thing to do. I have found, at least.
Yeah, I completely agree. The ability to simplify, technology, simplify solutions, even simplify problems is something which is super critical. One of the biggest mistake we are doing, everyone is doing, I do it as well, right? In communications, is that we assume that the other side is the same as us. It's just easier to assume that. You assume they have your knowledge, they assume they have your kind of like history, and it's really, really hard to put yourself in the other side, and in the shoe of the other person, as they say, um, and then we assume different things, and the communication breaks, and the value that is not communicated, and I think that's the biggest mistake. Marketers do that mistake all the time. One of the first thing you need to understand as a marketer is that you don't market to yourself. You need to understand, the other side. And yeah, I think it is so natural to assume that, and it's so easy to forget that you need to really think about who am I going to speak with, what's their objectives, what's their background, what do they want, what they want to get out of the conversation, what they need to do. Yeah, it is just very hard to do. It's not hard to do. It's easy to do if you think about it, but it's very hard to focus on it and really, actually do it. Everybody will say do it, right? But to actually do it in real time in a conversation, it's not easy.
Right. So, let's dive into a little bit about your company. So, what is the company that you're in charge of right now, and what's the problem that you're trying to solve with this company with your solution?
Yeah. So the company name is Armor, and we are a dedicated Kubernetes security company. Um, Kubernetes has grown to be pretty much, the de facto standard for, infrastructure for cloud workloads. And if we think about application protection platforms, if we think about what Gartner calls ASPM today, application security posture management, or if you think about CNAPP, Cloud Network Application Protection Platform, there are a lot of initials and a lot of different kind of like words to say one key thing, which is you need to protect an application running in the cloud, and you need to protect the cloud from the application running in the cloud. And those applications will 90% be running on Kubernetes. And that's why we believe that getting intimate with Kubernetes, with the configurations of Kubernetes, the configurations of the workloads in Kubernetes, getting all of the context of what's happening in runtime is crucial to securing workloads running in Kubernetes. And the main reason is that when you start to secure, cloud and Kubernetes native environments, there is I remember I talked about it over a year ago. Kubernetes as itself, yes, it is super complicated and, enormous and exponential number of, misconfigurations that can happen. But the main reason for the complexity of things running in Kubernetes is not Kubernetes itself, is the architecture that it is enabling. So once microservice-based, architecture is possible, just the number of software artifacts that are running, in your cluster or in your cloud is growing so exponentially. So vulnerabilities are growing exponentially. The attack surface is growing exponentially. The number of alerts is growing exponentially. So you have so much mess going on that you need a more adaptable security solution. And what we are trying to do in Armor is using that Kubernetes context, that workload context, that runtime context to adjust the security based on what's happening in your environment. So we will apply stronger hardening capabilities in places where the risk is higher. And we will apply more detailed, runtime security. We will tighten the security in places where we find the risk based on the context of Kubernetes being higher. And I think just the fact that, we secure all the same and, all workloads are born equally, it's no longer the case. You need to prioritize, because if you don't, you just spread too thin.
Yeah, it's a really good point. What you said is that Kubernetes is basically everywhere now. When I started to get into the cloud, it was kind of a niche area. Not very many people dove into it. Not very many people understood it. But it's becoming almost like its own domain within cloud security. And I was at a company where they were actively, migrating their infrastructure in AWS to Kubernetes instances. And, it was really challenging because I call it legacy, but they're still top of the line, our legacy EDR.
Yeah.
Of course, they offer a solution to protect your containers and whatnot. But when you put that agent on there, it's so heavyweight and it's not coded properly, to be running on such a lightweight infrastructure that you end up spending 2 to 3 times more than what you actually would have been spending. And that's a huge thing because Kubernetes is so, I guess, nimble, so easy to deploy. You could spin up, like if the cloud is easy to spin up resources, Kubernetes is like a factor of 10, right? Of how quickly you can actually spin up resources and start eating up a budget. And so if you extrapolate on it, you're spending a significant amount of money uh, eating up resources that you really probably shouldn't be. So I always found that interesting. Can we talk a little bit about the challenges of building a security platform on Kubernetes or for containers?
Yeah. Well, I think you mentioned one of the most critical aspects of it, which is scale and resource consumption. When you take like legacy, I'll call it legacy, even though, as you said, it's top notch. But if you take legacy type, solutions and agents and deploy them, in Kubernetes, and then, new pods spin up, new nodes may spin up, and you grow, horizontally and vertically, so, in many different ways. First of all, the resource consumption and the cost for the customer is getting super, super high. And that's why I think the first challenge that we have faced in building a Kubernetes solution is, okay, let's build it from the ground up for Kubernetes. Let's make sure when, for example, a pod is duplicating itself, you don't duplicate your memory footprint or your CPU, and you are staying, relatively lean. Let's use Kubernetes native capabilities in order to do security. If Kubernetes provides network policy, you don't need another agent to now run all of the network policy. You don't need another sidecar and another sidecar. Sidecars. I've seen companies that have, like, I don't know, 6 or 10 different sidecars on every pod. You spin up a pod, 10 other pods come up together. So being very mindful that you're running, like, it's, on one hand, it's a limiting factor, the fact that you're running on Kubernetes. You need to be as native as possible. On the other side, it gives you a lot of capabilities and a lot of native capabilities that, if you know to use them correctly, makes you much more efficient.
Hmm. Yeah. How is that? How is that learning gap with Kubernetes? How do you help your customers, I guess, bridge the gap? Because I ask this because most of the time, even for companies that are spending a lot of time and money and resources in Kubernetes, they're probably not going to know it as well as you or some of the experts at your company. How do you also take the time to, educate them into the capabilities of Kubernetes, what it should actually be, doing, how it should actually be designed, and things like that? Because, that's probably an important part of what you do, I would think, right? Because you don't want to just sell a widget, right? You want to really reinforce the value of that said widget, and explain to them why this is valuable over something else, why it works this way, right? Why you wouldn't go with that top of the line EDR solution that everyone has in their infrastructure, why you wouldn't go with that module, and why you would be going with something that is purpose built. Have you run into situations like that where you guys are the experts, so to speak, in the room, and you kind of have to educate your customers?
Yes, and I have to say, over the last, like, 2 years, what we need to teach or work with our customers on have changed, dramatically. And you're always, or at least you should be always ahead of your customers in terms of your knowledge and what you're seeing, because you just see more in the market in that specific field. So if you think about, 3 years ago or even 4 years ago, when we speak with customers about Kubernetes, I always, one of the biggest things that we always deal with is the fact that Kubernetes has a joint ownership. Kubernetes security has a joint ownership between a security team and a DevOps team or platform team or SRE team. The term itself is always changing. But if you think about 3 or 4 years ago, we would speak with the security teams about Kubernetes security, and honestly, they would be clueless, right? They would say, we don't know. We know we have Kubernetes. The DevOps team is running it. We give them some guidance, and we scan like images, but they don't really know what's going on in there. So that was the place back then. It's just getting ownership. Today, we are in a place where our thought leadership is much more around, how do security and DevOps team work together, right, to secure Kubernetes. We see more and more DevSecOps roles in the company. We see security engineers who know Kubernetes, but they will never know it as well as the DevOps. So one of the key things we need to help our customers is to mitigate between a security requirement, which is a very security-oriented thing, and then the remediation of that within Kubernetes, which is a very DevOps thing. And we actually invested a lot of time into creating features that will, cater to that specific gap filling. So, for example, just a nuance, if our system gives an alert to the security team about a misconfiguration that might be problematic in the environment security-wise, we also issue the remediation advice to the DevOps team to apply. And we build it based off the Kubernetes context and the runtime context in a way that it will not break the application. So, we are always, I would say the main thing our platform needs to do is to continuously shrink the attack surface, but in a way that the DevOps feel confident to use, right? That doesn't break applications. And I think that's first of all, I believe it's one of our key differentiators, but it's also, I think, one of the biggest bridges that you need to build between security and DevOps.
Yeah, that relationship is so critical. It's becoming more and more important to really build that relationship between security and the developers and operations, right? Because these organizations, these environments are getting so large that it's no longer under, one team or one manager, right? Like there's several different pieces at play. And that kind of ties into what we were talking about before, being that engineer, being able to, break things down, have the soft skills to be able to talk to, anyone in the room and ensure that they understand. One of the, I guess maybe one of the biggest challenges that I have faced, even in recent years, is being that security expert when we're talking about Kubernetes, right? Without really knowing Kubernetes and trying to get across, security standards to developers and saying, how do we achieve it? Right. Because, from an engineering perspective, right, I put on my engineering hat. It's like, okay, well, let's learn Kubernetes. How hard could it possibly be? How long could it possibly take me? Right. Maybe a month or two. And then you start getting into it and, 2 months in, you feel like you know nothing. And it's like, okay, I seem to be starting completely over in this area. So I need to lean more on the knowledge of other people that have been working with it every single day.
Yeah.
And try to make these security, I guess, requirements, make sense to them and try and reword it so that it makes sense to them so that they could translate it into Kubernetes and say, oh, there's this whole other, management plane, right, that we haven't thought about before, but that does the thing that you're thinking of, right? It's a balance. It's interesting how that conversation just tied together with what we were talking about before with soft skills.
Yeah, completely. And it's, it's almost like, there's this movie, men are from somewhere and then women are from Mars and like that. So it's same for security and DevOps. And if I need to kind of like pinpoint it, security many times, they speak a language of risk, right? They speak a language of, posture, which is a language that the engineers or the DevOps, they don't speak that language. They don't talk in terms of risk. They talk in terms of, configurations. They talk in terms of, engineering, right? They talk about configuration. They talk about, software packages. They talk about network, IPs. That's their language. And what we see today is that security, they need to know Kubernetes well enough to kind of like translate some of the risk requirement and the risk terminology into technical terms. But also the developers on their side, they need to learn the risk implications of different things, and they need to start thinking about risk as well. And I think that's what, every platform that gives security for Kubernetes will need, will need to manage, basically.
Yeah, and even recently, the past couple roles that I've had, it's been acting as that security bridge to the rest of the organization, that are managing these complex infrastructures, right? And it is actually, knowing just enough to use the right terms about this technology to translate, these security components into something that they understand so that we can, make progress. It has been, I mean, it's interesting. It's probably the evolution of an engineer, so to speak, right? Is, you go from being hands on keyboard, I'm going to write this code and fix this problem. And, we're going to go through it like that, to being, the subject matter expert in an area and then translating it to other departments, right? For them to actually do that work. And it's that transition, I guess, has been slightly difficult for me to I guess stomach, right? Because I still want to get in there, and I'm still kind of paranoid because I'm not in the weeds like I used to be, so to speak. And so
Yeah,
I'm like, man, is someone gonna like think I'm, useless and lay me off because I'm not in the weeds like you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
it's that mental shift,
yeah. I have to say, another time in my life, at least, that I've went through, this type of like dissonance that you're mentioning is, for example, just when you move from being a developer to a team leader, right? Yes, you just lose the capability or the capacity to know every function that every developer writes, and you need to feel comfortable with like giving guidance and being, more of the architectural oversight. You're the security architectural oversight, right? And and I completely get it. We're all in some ways, well, maybe not all of us, but maybe you and I are control freaks, right? We want to know that exactly what's going on, and it's hard. But it goes again. It goes to what we talked about before, and I think you said it right. It goes to the soft skills, into collaboration, in working together, communicating well, in order to feel comfortable with this new situation.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, if you look, 5, 10 years out, right? In technology, that's extremely difficult to do, to look 10 years out. It's probably really difficult to look 5 years out. Where do you think cloud infrastructure as a whole is going, right? Because we have Kubernetes, but I wonder what that next iteration of Kubernetes is. Is it serverless, do you think?
Well, there are already, some, there's Fargate, or the I don't know, autopilot from Google, which are kind of like they're running containers, but they are serverless. I think that's
Hmm.
the problem today, is that it is very, very costly to go. But also, Kubernetes makes it so much easier to manage the servers themselves. Then it makes me think about, okay, so if servers are so easy to manage, why go serverless? Um, you know, I don't, I try not to make, predictions, because everybody that ever made predictions probably was wrong. But one of the things that I'm seeing is that I think the cloud as a cloud service is going to proliferate. So we have Amazon, then we have Google, now we have Azure, we have IBM. I see companies starting to do their own cloud. So what I suspect might happen is that the cloud technologies will just be, in so many places where you could utilize cloud type technologies, companies are already doing that. Kubernetes is running on premise, and companies are doing like cloud native, but it's on bare metal in their own environments. It costs them less than going to Amazon if they're big enough. So I actually think, I don't think the big change going forward will be in, what servers we are using on, or the architecture of the server or Kubernetes. I think it's going to be about the type of services that you can get from the cloud provider. I think cloud providers will win and lose based on, the ease of their, AI models that they provide via APIs, and, the database services and how quick those are. And I think that's where the next battlefield is in.
That's really fascinating. What you're describing really eliminates a lot of the security misconfiguration that goes on in the cloud. Recently, right, I ran a report in the environment and saw a bunch of public S3 buckets. And, I'm sitting here like, this is, literally, third or fourth time that I've had to go over this with, all of my developer teams, probably about 150 different people. And, I'm trying to figure out how to finally solve this problem so that, we wouldn't still encounter it, because my environment's a little bit unique. We have limitations around what we can implement from a security perspective, which makes these findings a little bit more difficult. But that's really interesting, because what you're talking about is kind of a overarching control plane that is running on the cloud, and you just tell that service what you want to be using, what you want to do, what you want to accomplish, and they figure out the most efficient way to get it done for you, and really leverage their own internal skill sets to do that within whatever cloud provider makes the most sense. It's really interesting. I haven't thought about it like that before. Are you seeing that anywhere in the market right now?
No, to be honest, not like what we do see, multi-cloud environments, and then everybody is using multi-cloud. Is starting to think about, for example, security-wise, do we have like cross-cloud communication and what's going on there, and can an attacker move from one environment to another? So we see a lot of that. Also, I'm very much in the security domain. So I'm mostly seeing, the concerns of security in these domains and less about the control plane, the applicative control plane. So it's hard to me, but I can say that we see more and more, every big company is now having a multi-cloud environment and an on-premise environment as well, and all of that needs to be managed.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It'll be interesting to see where the space goes, in the near future, and I wonder if satellites will play a role in it. But Shauli, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before I let you go, how about you tell my audience where they could find you if they wanted to reach out, where they could find your company if they want to learn more?
Yeah, so me, just Google Shauli Rozen, SHAULI ROZN on LinkedIn. I think I'm the only one, or at least I'm one of the ones that will surely pop up. My company, armosec.io. And also, as important as my company is our open source project, which we almost didn't get a chance to talk about at all, which is called Kubescape, which is today one of the most prominent open source projects for Kubernetes security out there. It's an official Linux Foundation CNCF project, hundreds of thousands of users, super successful. And anyone who will contribute or use that, it's also a win for me, and I really, really encourage you to try it out.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to have you back on to talk more about that project.
Yeah, we can do like 60 minutes on the open source itself, and we talked about how did they get into security and how did they get to funding a company. how did I get into open source? And, the open source journey as a whole is a fascinating journey on its own.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll figure that out and make that happen.
Yeah.
So thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode.